Hello and welcome to ATARC's webinar series. Today we will be discussing threats of ransomware using Zero Trust to build cyber resilience and how that can affect agencies and their way in which they approach risk. My name is Kirsten Patton and I'm the Working Group Program Manager here at ATARC, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, and we are a nonprofit that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. We provide ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. I would like to welcome all of our attendees, and a special thanks to Tiffany Haynes and Jeffrey Phelan and the rest of the Rubric team. This afternoon on the agenda, we will hear from our panelists, followed by a Q&A, and pop in a few poll questions as we go. Before we begin, I just want to encourage you, the audience, to please submit questions of your own in the Q&A section of this platform. And also remember to answer the poll questions as they come up in order to ensure that you receive your CPE credits. With that said, I would like to ask all of our panelists to now come on camera, and I'm going to have each of you go ahead and introduce yourselves. Tell us who you are, what agency you're with, and anything else that you would like to share with our audience up top. Let's go ahead and hear from Sean first, please.
Hello, my name is Sean Connolly. I work at CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We like security so much we have it twice in our name. I lead the TIC program, the Trusted Internet Connections program at CISA. TIC is one of the primary network and architectural strategy initiatives across federal civilian executive branch agencies, led of course by OMB and their TIC memos. We work with agencies trying to help them secure and modernize their networks. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Let's hear from Chandrea next.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sean Leblanovitz, the Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity and Supply Chain Risk Management at GSA. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. We're doing a lot to just sort of help agencies up their game for supply chain risk management. And of course, with Zero Trust architecture that we'll be talking about today, we've got a lot of exciting things to discuss. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I just want to make sure I get your name correct. Is it Chandra?
It's Chandria, but I go by Sean. But today I'll be Chandria because I don't want to get confused with Sean.
I was going to ask you that next. So thank you, Chandria. And then over to Kevin.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kevin Bingham with the National Security Agency. I'm the Zero Trust technical lead for us. We're focused on for the most part, studying the problem, understanding it, spreading the word on Zero Trust. Not only are we trying to produce guidance and help people understand what Zero Trust is, but also innovate in our Zero Trust lab environment in order to come up with effective Zero Trust solutions. So the first Zero Trust reference architecture that's been put out, at least by the DoD, we worked with CISA and DoD CIO and Cybercom on producing that. That was the first product that we got put out there. We've also got work in our lab where we're coming up with solutions architectures. We'll produce more guidance. We talk with others in the community to make sure that we're keeping that guidance relevant and what people need. And then, in the end, we try to innovate in our lab environment, learn and evolve whatever guidance or solutions architectures we're trying to demonstrate with.
Excellent, thank you. And over to you, Elisa.
Hello, Elisa Piola, pronouns she, her, and I'm an IT specialist who focuses on cyber risk management. And the current challenge that I'm focusing on solving is providing an authentication solution. So I'm a product manager for an agile team that we're developing an upcoming custom developed solution.
Thank you. And then over to Jeffrey.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Phelan. I'm the public sector CTO at Rubric. I've made a career out of being the dumbest guy in the room, and it looks like today's no exception to that rule. So I'm really excited to sort of be here with this all-star group of panelists and speakers to talk about Zero Trust. It's going to be great.
Excellent. Thank you all. And just as a reminder for those at home, we really want to hear from you and the questions that you have. So please send them in. But until then, I have my own list of questions and we'll use those to get the party started. Sean, starting with you, why are traditional IT security defenses not sufficient anymore, making us turn to zero trust principles in data management?
Sure, that's a great question to start with. So I think, for the last 10, 15 years, especially on the civilian side, the primary strategy was the tick 1, tick 2 reference architectures. And that was really built around the traditional castle and moat philosophy, having strong external perimeters with firewall stacks. And in those firewall stacks were, of course, sensors, IDS, detonation chambers and such. But really, especially in the last few years, between the rise of mobility, a lot of us being at home for teleworking, the rise of cloud computing, that whole concept of the perimeter is quickly evaporating. And so we need to come up with a strategy that is able to both understand the landscape on the operational side, just what I talked about, as we have more distributed users, more distributed assets, then also the threat environments change at the same time. The threat actors becoming more advanced, persistent. They're trying new ways to gain access to our systems. And so I think as we move from the old traditional castle and moat philosophy to a zero trust, where it's more distributed boundaries, and you're more trying to understand what are you trying to protect at a more granular level than we did with tick 2 and castle moat, I think that's where we start off wondering or using zero trust to answer those questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll open up that same question to other folks on the panel too. Chandria, maybe you would like to weigh in. Has that been your experience as well with your role at GSA?
Yeah, absolutely, Kirsten. I always say with convenience becomes more complication, right? So the more IoT devices that are out there, the more smart apps, as more adversaries become smarter, right? These tend to leverage the things that we use to make our lives easier. And we've got to have a different approach to how we secure that. I'll also add on the flip side of that is, how do I ask for the right contract vehicles to get that security that I need? So we're really looking at how we help agencies and most importantly, our acquisition workforce understand what it means by zero trust, right? It's not something I can go pull off a shelf and say, now that I've got zero trust, I'm done. It's understanding that entire principle and methodology and how we can move forward to implement it. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. And for the panelists, I won't call on each of you for the same question, but if you do have additional comment, feel free to come off mute and weigh in as well. I see Kevin just came off mute. Did you have additional comment?
Yeah, no, so I started my time at NSA in the red team, and back in those days, and it was first years of 2000, it was quite obvious, as Sean says, that the perimeter model wasn't working, and you could see what the adversary, or in our case the red team, were doing in the network, and I quickly realized that as a security model, or even when we applied the term layered defense, in theory it would work, but in reality we were continuing to fall back on a perimeter model that didn't work then, and it doesn't work now, and it really was the wrong model to begin with. And so our team is really excited. We at our agency have put guidance out that talk about the importance of assuming breach in your environment and protecting privileged accounts and doing segmentation. But one of the powers of zero trust is that John Kindervag over at Forrester at the time wrote it all down in a framework that we could say, okay, now we've got something that's actually written that provides a discipline to what we should be doing differently. It's easy to say, you got to do layered defense, but if there's no discipline on what you're supposed to be doing to implement that in a consistent way, then we don't make much progress. Zero trust is being a discipline framework that we can get around, that within the DoD and our intel agencies, that federal government can get around, and certainly private industry is getting around, to be consistent with how we approach cybersecurity, which advances the vendor space, it advances all of us in our journey towards zero trust. And it brings a lot of focus on the data, right? And with the theme of this talk today, data has always been a challenge, and we know that. And we finally got a new model, a nice new cybersecurity model that drives us towards protecting that data. So it's I think we're on the right path. It's an exciting time, I think, for all of us in cybersecurity.
Absolutely. So Elisa, for those of us who are not immersed in cybersecurity, how would you describe what does it really mean to apply a zero trust architecture for data management?
Yeah, and it's kind of exactly what Kevin was saying of like, the layer defense, it was great in concept, and we're moving to this zero trust, and like the modality of the internet has changed from the last 20 years. So we're coming out with more internet facing and not having things behind the perimeter. So kind of, what CISA says, right? Taking one of your lines, Sean, is no trust, no problem, right? So we're trying to apply the more human-centered design and like concepts that, we here at TTS are trying to go out and do out for the community, and that have that no problem and that no trust portion become a reality, and making sure that all the components are in place that haven't already existed because maybe everything was hidden behind a wall, the electronic firewall. So,
yeah. Hey, thank you. And Jeff, coming from the industry side, if you could please speak to that same question as well, and also how important it is for the government and industry to work together in terms of implementation for the zero trust architecture and data management.
Yeah, so I think, the zero trust as it's really emerging is exciting, right? I can remember back with HSPD 12, TIC 1, TIC 2. I had the pleasure of working with the guys at SRA who stood up US CERT and were part of the Einstein program originally. And so to Kevin's point earlier, you get to work around guys like Tony Sager up at NSA, and they're trust nothing, suspect everything. And I think that as the market is coming and industry, it's an exciting time. I know we would have all liked to maybe gotten here a little earlier, but I think this is really good. And all of these organizing principles that are coming together, what ATARC's doing with the Zero Trust Lab, with CISA and OMB is really, really good. From our perspective, zero trust has sort of always lived at the network security level, and we're really approaching it from the infrastructure perspective. So how do you really begin to educate end users and organizations around immutability? What does that really look like? Making sure that there's not a lot of FUD and there's lots of buzzwords out there. So that's an area that we work aggressively on. And how do you bring security to the point of data, to Kevin's point earlier, which is what we're really focused on.
That's great. Thank you. Let's see, we have an audience question. I'll read that one in just a moment, but let's go ahead and pop up our first poll, which is going to be, how familiar are you with your agency's ransomware recovery plan? And you get to choose on the scale of familiarity how familiar you are. So please take a moment and answer that. You'll receive your CPE credits if you do so. I think it was Jason Miller moderating a panel, and he said we need Jeopardy music while we wait for the results. We'll see how we can get that incorporated. All right, Alyssa, whenever you think we are ready for those results, let's see how familiar folks are. Not too familiar. All right, well, now we know. So for the audience question, we have, it's a little lengthy, I'll read it. Zero trust architecture has been developed since the late 1990s and has become more mature architecture in 2018. Why did it fail against SolarWinds and other examples? It defeated organizations' secure and trusted DevOps, analysis sandbox, multi-factor authentication, masqueraded and evaded network behavior modeling, and data loss prevention detection technology. So this person's question is, what has changed in the zero trust architecture to prevent these attacks? And what do you need from vendors, cybersecurity vendors, academia, et cetera? So let's see, who from our panelists would like to tackle that one first?
I could start. This is Sean. I think I challenge a little bit. Yes, while the zero trust architecture, as Kevin mentioned, it came back from, John Kindervag back at Forrester in 2011. Some of those principles go back much farther, right? Least privilege, of course, and some other ones. But while it's been out there for the federal government side, I don't know if this is more for the federal civilian executive branch, but it's really, we're just starting to embrace those zero trust architecture principles. And so we're just beginning through OMB and the draft zero trust strategy that they released last month and they'll be working on. We're just starting to move those architectures in place, because before the architectures, more about the consolidation of those access points, again, going through those finite firewall stacks. And zero trust kind of is exactly the opposite of that, where it's not about building strong walls at the perimeter. It's more about building from the inside out. And so I think from the civilian side, or at least we're just starting on this, and it's going to take years. I think, Google, they have one of the first companies that really moved to zero trust. And they said it took them about 7 years with their Beyond Trust initiative to move to zero trust. So it's going to take a long time, I think, for most of the federal government to move or shift. We need to start. And thanks to Krista Russia and the foresight from OMB, we're moving that right direction. But I'm not going to look at it as something that has been applicable to federal civilian executive branch for that long of a time period.
Thank you for answering that one, Sean. Any other panelists? Kevin?
Yeah, so I'll kind of add on to what Sean said on that one, and before you even started talking about how long it's going to take, I mean, that is a lesson learned when we work with customers over and over again, that it's the practice of zero trust and the maturing of zero trust over time. That's why we have our maturity models that are getting published out there. I think most people are familiar with what CISA has put out related to zero trust maturity. The DoD reference architecture has references to that as well. And it really, we can't just claim that we're zero trust and get hit by something as nasty as a SolarWinds supply chain attack and say, darn it, it didn't work. How come it didn't work for me? It's the application of the pillars and the capabilities within zero trust that give us an opportunity to defend against things like SolarWinds. If somebody asks me, what are we going to do to defend against something as hard as a SolarWinds, I'd say, you're going to work on your zero trust strategy and you continue to drive forward. And you're going to hope that the vendors get better and that their practices get better. But we actually heard a few lessons from some organizations that had it in place that felt pretty confident that they could have mitigated a good portion of the impact of something like SolarWinds. It's about the application. We can say layered defense didn't work, throw it out, but the reality is we never implemented appropriate layers. We didn't really have much guidance or strategy on how to. I think there's a lot of opportunity as we practice and mature zero trust, that it will be able to be our. It's not going to say that we're not going to suffer impacts from an event like that, but we should still be able to limit the losses, the damage, the propagation, the losses that we have, especially if we focus on protecting the data effectively.
Excellent responses and great questions. So please keep them coming. Chandra, could you please speak to the relation and significance of the 5 pillars of the zero trust maturity model? So those being identity, device, network, application, workload, and data.
Yeah, thank you. And so I think part of that comes back to some of the complexities, right? And, as the former question that came in was, why aren't we doing this sooner? It takes some time to identify, where the users are and, how we need to sort of redefine roles, figuring out what assets to secure and how to do that, right? So I think agencies are going to have to spend some time really sort of thinking about their environment, what's most important to that organization before we can even think about looking at a zero trust model principle to sort of implement, right? So what works in one agency may not work in another. So being able to look at your users and making sure that we're looking at their functions, right? Because with zero trust, it's not that, oh, I'm going to sort of pass my credential one time and I'm good, it's going to remember me. It's each time. So we've got to think about that load and productivity, and which priorities do we need to take place over others. So I think it's quite complex, but that's part of what's sort of making the shift, I think, a bit more challenging. And I also want to add sort of this convergence that's happening. So we mentioned SolarWinds before. It wasn't just about that zero trust issue and getting into sort of the crown jewels. It's about supply chain risk management, which is really huge now. So it's taking regular cyber as we knew it. It's taking supply chain risk management as we know it, and it's taking principles like ZTA, and organizations are having to prioritize, where am I even going to start? So we start to see those questions come in. Well, man, I don't know what the ransomware policy is, because we're still trying to figure some of this stuff out across agencies. Of course, there's this sort of slide that I look at. You've got a lot of agencies that are doing well and know exactly what they need to do, but there are a lot of agencies that still are trying to spell scrim, to be quite frank with you. So I say all that to say there's a lot to really consider in those pillars, and it's going to take time for agencies to sort of figure out their networks and what's important to them. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think
Go ahead.
I can jump in. Yeah, I think spot on what's been said so far. Just to give maybe an example on the identity pillar, a lot of agencies we talk to, they believe the identity pillar is really the most critical, if the only pillar. And to go back, what was being discussed a little earlier around SolarWinds, right? There's a couple different avenues of attack that were all under that campaign. And one of them was what's called the golden SAML attack. And just to deconstruct that down, really what's like is if an adversary was able to take over a Department of Motor Vehicles, and the adversary is now able to issue driver's license. If a business was looking at driver's license, they think it'd be legit because it was issued by the DMV. The adversary in the golden SAML attack was able to take over the system that was issuing those security tokens. And so when the system was looking to see if it was a valid security token, that forged token was now being used. And that's all under the credential or the identity pillar. And so again, I think as Kevin was talking about before, we need to layer these pillars together. We can't just rely simply on the identity pillar alone, but we need to look at the device, the network, and the other pillars themselves to help complement and support each of these, because not one pillar will solve everything.
Excellent points. Any other panelists want to weigh in on that before we move on?
I'll keep it quick, but yeah, I'll just say absolutely 1 foot stomp what Sean just said, and we continue to tell anyone that we're talking to that you may have some success in some assessments by doing a few of the pillars, but ultimately those pillars are defining what your effective layer defense needs to be. They've all got to be integrated together. They all have to be aware of each other. And we challenge all organizations to make sure that you're not only looking at what the system model would show as the 5 pillars, right, with automation and orchestration and visibility analytics supporting all of those, governance as well. In the DoD model, those are individual separate pillars in a 7-pillar model. But the challenge is to make sure that you're progressing in each one of those, because it really is important that when one layer fails, and it will, right? That's the assumption you have going in with assumed breach, that you're going to catch it with the other layers that are there to stop it. If identity fails, then you've got some segmentation, and some data protection that's helping you, and an analytics component that's telling you what's just occurred.
Thank you. So we just had an audience question come through. Maybe Elisa, you want to take this one? What capabilities do you need to improve identity? What capabilities do you need to improve identity capabilities, such as biometrics, MLDL, to identify people? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I know of one capability. For instance, within GSA, we in TTS have several shared service for government. But one of our current capabilities can directly assist in the agency's zero trust architectures. So the strong authentication is the first layer of modern online systems. And login.gov is GSA's shared service that provides federal agencies with a trusted authentication mechanism for their citizen-facing applications. So it is a multi-factor credential that meets NIST authentication assurance level 2, and it can be used across a multitude of government websites, from USA Jobs to Social Security Administration, and there are over 300 million credentials now under the management of login.gov. And we see this as one of our key components on an agency zero trust architecture. So that's one of them.
Thank you. Any other panelists have insight into that?
I would take a little bit of a counter narrative. One thing I think you see from the OMB Zero Trust memo is the idea of having more of an enterprise level identity management solution. And I think what that's trying to articulate is, from talking to agencies, some agencies have been challenged in terms of who owns or leads more the identity role. Some agencies believe the Active Directory shop owns identity. Another part of the agency may believe the PKI shop owns it, or the cloud identity group owns it. And so I think there needs to be more understanding for the enterprise level for each of these agencies of that common voice for identity itself. And that's one thing we've been working with OMB and GSA and some of the agencies on, just help shape that enterprise level identity solution for the agency itself.
That's good. Thank you.
And we don't want to forget those privileged accounts, right? That's a big foot stomp for us in making sure you've got those all protected as much as you can as you march down your larger identity strategy.
Fantastic. Jeff, maybe we can hear from you on this next one. An audience is asking, is there any future state envisioned where the data files themselves can be defensible and seen as full-blown enterprise resource? What are your thoughts on that coming from industry?
Well, one of the things that, has always frustrated me is if an adversary can get through the network perimeter, it's sort of like the infrastructure is a sitting duck, right? And so you have an adversary gets in, they start moving laterally, and then whether they're going to, exfiltrate data or encrypt it, or they want to delete it or do other things to it, that's always been a challenge. And so I think from an industry perspective, what we're trying to do is take some principles that we hear in the DoD and how do you create a moving defense, right? We have a layered defense at the network perimeter. How can we now make the infrastructure a little smarter? So how do you integrate endpoint detection and response and logging and intel services? And we have a lot of information on adversaries and their TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures they use, and even sometimes the type of data they're trying to steal. So we've got the ability now, when we see these types of threats, to coordinate the infrastructure. And so, for example, if we know we've got an actor coming in, and let's say they just love Oracle databases, and an organization has a standard policy where they just back that up every day, once a day. Well, now we can say, hey, there's a threat that's hit the enterprise. Let's back that data up now, and let's start doing it every hour. Instead of doing it here on location, let's move it off to a second site. So those types of automation and intelligence capabilities are here today, and a lot of folks don't understand the art of the possible. So we think this is another way to complement zero trust as it's implemented, because as Sean said earlier, complexity, we say complexity is easy, simple is hard. And people really don't understand the level of complexity across these organizations. It's incredible. So to Sean's point earlier, it's going to take years to do that. And we need to figure out a way for them to hit singles and doubles. And so this is what we're doing from an industry perspective to try to help the data be a little more responsive to what's going on at the perimeter level and at the network level around threat detection.
Thank you for that response. Any others want to chime in? All right, we'll move on to the next question then. So, Chandria, at a high level, how would you say that your agency is doing with submitting plans and milestones for implementing zero trust architecture per the 2021 Cybereo?
Thank you. So that Cybereo, that's sort of a mouthful in itself. I think a lot of it, of course, initially is awareness. We're pulling together the right team of people across our organization to identify those key assets that we need to look at. Some of it, of course, is reclassifying some of our data, which will elevate some of the initial security categorizations that we had for some of our systems. So we're looking at that. Another big piece, of course, is the FAR changes that are going to be coming down, and what does that mean for how we're looking at our current contracts and how that we rely on our vendors to do certain things with SLAs and in our current statement of work. So we're looking at that to see how that's going to be driven. Also, Section 4, a huge piece, looking at critical software, understanding what the definition of critical software is and being able to identify those assets. And that sort of moves us into sort of where we need to sort of play in the zero trust space. We developed, of course, in concert with CISA, the Zero Trust Buyer's Guide, of course, to look at awareness first, to make sure that we're all sort of thinking the same things. We're putting policies together. We're meeting with our teams to just think about how much it's going to cost, right? No one's talking yet about what it's going to cost to upgrade some of these network devices and re-looking at our enterprise. So we're doing that now, and we're meeting bi-weekly just to figure out how to do that.
Excellent. Kevin, how about you over at NSA?
So in our consulting role, we get a chance to communicate with a lot of organizations as they come up with their zero trust plans, and one of the things that we see is we normally have to advise to go further in is a lot of organizations will look to try to take capabilities or programs that they've already got in place right now, and as they start understanding the zero trust model and the pillars of zero trust, they'll try to place existing programs in those, which is fine, right? But in that, again, theme of maturing all of our pillars towards zero trust, we really recommend that organizations maybe set up some use cases for themselves. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to protect data? You want to protect data in the wild? Is ransomware, a big use case that you're trying to protect against? What are the things that would hurt you there? Loss of confidentiality, certainly the loss of availability. All right, both of those are ones that would need to be addressed. We'd love for the data to be protected to a level that even if it did get extracted or exfilled from the network, that it can protect itself in the wild, if you will. Right? Those are opportunities for us to advance to. So ultimately, think about what the outcomes are, and then look at the programs that you've got and say, is it really achieving the outcome that I'm trying to get to? If it's not, it's fine, but it's a stepping stone to where you're trying to go. And that's, again, another power of the Zero Trust framework is it allows you to bend the things that you're currently working on, but also recognize that you're not where you need to be. And so you need to do roadmaps across those different pillars in order to continue to advance.
Great. Thank you for sharing. And so an audience member needs a little bit of clarification. Sean, maybe you can help with this one. He says, so from this discussion, each pillar is necessary, but is the set sufficient or is there something missing? So do you think that you could kind of help him better understand?
Sure, yeah. One thing with these pillars that's kind of challenge each of these pillars, device, data, identity, network, application, each of these are in their own stovepipe 20+ year industries. And it's really tough to like distill 20-year industries down just to like these simple pillars. But as Kevin was saying, there's a lot of overlap, especially just between the vendors having solutions in the different pillars themselves and trying to connect them together for a simpler solution for the customer. But there is certainly overlap between those pillars themselves. And again, the industries themselves have that overlap. So I think it's one of the things we've talked about, as we start to develop this maturity model. One of the things from OMB has been very clear on that, what you see from CISA and what OMB is putting out there really is just one of many different paths on that zero trust journey. And I don't think we capture, at all the full plethora of choices that are out there. These are just some of them that we capture in a very short amount of time, but there's a lot of different ways to consider moving that journey. I think going back to what Kevin talked about, there is this concept of maybe some zero trust playbooks, a couple of different programs I'm associated with that are considering how to take those lessons learned, work with some of those agencies that have more progressive or more forward leaning on the zero trust journey and distill those lessons learned into these playbooks, and then be able to share them with a greater community.
Thank you for the clarification. Jeff, are you going to chime in?
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what Sean talked about with the overlap piece. And, you know, we, the guys over at MITRE and Pete Kaloromakis, they just published the Defend framework, which is kind of the companion to the attack framework, which everybody's really been focused on in the industry. And I think, you know, it took them 3 years and they analyzed over 1 million patents because, to your point, Sean, right now there's so much overlap in the tools, and with all the marketing language, you can't really figure out, do I have 3 different things that all do the same thing? And I don't know that because they have different, you know, branding terms and things like that. So I think that's, you know, a really great thing that's coming on, and all of this coming together at the same time. It's just, again, another tool to help people make better decisions. And I think one of the things we run into is this complexity issue. And, you know, we focus on the backup infrastructure and operationalizing it. And we're finding that a lot of organizations don't look there to save money to pay for these zero trust activities. And that's something we encourage them to do. Agencies have petabytes of data. A lot of them don't know where most of it is, or a lot of it is they don't know the last time they touched it. They're spending, you know, gold-plated dollars on storing that and making it accessible. And one of the things we want to encourage them to do is look at that underlying infrastructure, and through simplification, reducing of tools and complexity, there's a lot of sort of, you know, cost avoidance and found dollars that let them invest in these activities, which we think are really important. So I'd encourage people to really look at that part of their infrastructure, which normally they're not looking at to save money in.
Excellent, thank you. So we will take a break for just a moment to answer the second poll question. And while we do that, if our panelists go ahead and read ahead the questions that the audience has sent through so that you have your responses prepared. That being said, the poll today is, out of the following priorities, please select what you believe to be the most important for your agency. The options include modernization, reducing complexity and costs, automation, infrastructure and cloud, data security on-prem and hybrid, or data management harmonization, a single pane of glass. So please go ahead and select those answers. Let's see here. First audience question. How granular should the trust boundaries be in order to detect malware stealing data, performing lateral movement, changing privileges? Note, many of the techniques hackers use occur on the host itself, and by the time its impact is visible in the network, damage is already done. How should zero trust concept evolve to deal with finding threats that already exist on internal systems? Thoughts from our panel.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was looking at a different question, but so this is the one that started out, how granular should the trust boundaries be?
Correct.
Sure. So that, yeah, I could start off with that one, but I think, you know, from before, we really had those boundaries, as Kevin was talking about, far away from where the data was and where the security was needed. And so with John Kindervag and the zero trust philosophy, you're really starting from the inside out. You're defining what needs to be protected, and then put those layers of defense around that what we would call your asset, your resource, instead of before where you had these security zones way out far from where the data was. So it is, to your point, I think especially in TIC, we have these trust zones, and trust zones an elastic concept because the TIC program needs to be able to support everything from the traditional castle and moat architectures more to a more granular level. But that trust zone is an abstract concept, which could be anything from a data center down to something more close to a device like an iPhone. These concepts are the same, but how you protect those solutions may be a little different, where you place those policy enforcement points, how the policy decision engine in the background works. But in essence, that concept's still the same, that you have these trust zones and you layer those protections around those trust zones to protect that resource inside of it. But to your point, I think we are becoming more granular. There's more of these micro segmentations Kevin was talking about, and this distribution, if you will, of what you're trying to protect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Kevin?
Yeah, if I can add on to what Sean's saying, and it's, you know, this concept of trust at all in a zero trust framework gets circular. And I remember in the early days, a year and a half ago, we decided stop using the term trust and we went to confidence levels. But the scenario that's being asked about in that question, right, is exactly what we're trying to defeat with zero trust. I mean, we are trying to eliminate trust within the environment. If we could, we would eliminate, certainly any shared privileged accounts on devices that were exposed to the internet. We would try to limit as much privileged account activity that exists on those exposed devices as we could. Through segmentation, we try to stop all lateral propagation. We would set up our analytics in order to look for that, and have internal mechanisms that allowed as much microsegmentation as we could, so that those particular attack methods aren't even useful to begin with. Easy to say, right? It's going to take time to do, but the organizations that we've seen be successful the fastest, they'll take a fairly simple approach. Red team will come in, do an assessment. They'll either place them in the network and say, okay, you have to escalate and move from here, or they'll say, we want you to come in from the outside. Nonetheless, the results are generally the same. They get privileged access, moving through the network, stealing the data, ready to destroy or cause availability attacks. When you use those red teams to motivate you and to inform you of theory versus reality, start implementing your zero trust plan, bring those red teams back in. Again, it may be a year later, see what they're able to do. What did you get right? What didn't you get right? Reiterate, right? And so you're creating a scenario. In fact, one of the important scenarios for you to create is, and one that we've tried ourselves, is to put that adversary simulated for us, red team, in place, start implementing the zero trust environment, and see if you're starting to make it so that the adversary is losing access. They're not able to move around as much. You're starting to detect them, as you implement the proper analytics techniques, so forth. But ultimately, that's, I think, the big problem we're all trying to solve, and certainly protecting the data is central to that. Access to the data, those micro perimeters that John mentions, can be powerful in enabling all of what I've just described.
Thank you, Kevin. And I see kind of a juicy one next. What are the U.S. government agencies' biggest concerns that keep them up at night where zero trust might fail in future attacks? For example, the next big attack, enterprise compliance software. So let's hear from the agencies. Elisa, any thoughts, response to that one?
Yeah, kind of what Sean was saying for like Golden SAML. For being a product owner that uses SAML technology that might touch like every identity provider in the government sphere, that definitely keeps me up at night. But I do feel better that we're starting to at least identify and categorize critical software and put some tighter visibility and risk mitigations around it. So it's like bittersweet in some ways.
Thank you. And then Sean, how about over at CISA? What do you think?
Yeah, I think just, obviously cybersecurity being our forefront, just in general, we're always concerned of what's coming around the corner, what's going to be new. Internally, from CISA, you've seen a very large push. This relates back to the EO toward endpoint detection response, where we're going to agencies to have placement of EDR solutions in place to these agencies to help mitigate in ways that possibly that the SolarWinds of breach expose, or realize we need to change some of our defenses. So between the EDR solution coming out, the zero trust solutions that we have that we're talking about here, of course, some of the logging requirements, but I think that EO in general shows where a lot of those concerns are trying to be addressed across the board from the White House, from OMB, and all the agencies.
Thank you. And Kevin or Chandria, you wanted to weigh in on this one? We can move to the next.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, well, just real quick, I just say that there's a huge human element to this too, right? And so that there's plenty of things that would keep me up at night, it would keep our team members up at night, that we're worried about as far as threats concerned. But as far as driving forward with progress, there's a human element that becomes a very big challenge. And we're starting to get some really good guidance out there, but we have to take that guidance and we have to figure out how to implement it effectively, again, from beginning to end, and not just sprinkle a little bit of stuff in there that we can say we've got zero trust and say, boss, we're done. We've got it. We got the pillars covered. So that's, I think, the challenge to everyone on this call is to realize to not ignore the human factors, and make sure when you start this that you've got senior executive leadership support all the way down to the implementers, all the way down to the IT professionals and administrators that are making it happen. Everyone's got to be on board in order for it to be successful.
Chandria?
Yeah, I was just going to add, Kevin hit it on the head, is that human piece, right? We're going to have something else that happens, but how do we respond to it? In my role, within the ITC part of GSA, it's really more working with the agencies and working with vendors. But what we find the most challenging is something happens, we're not necessarily helping or a posture to deal with it. So having that leadership sort of commitment, right? Having good policies in place, making sure that we've got good contracts in place with our vendors is a huge part of making sure that Zero Trust, one, works for us, but two, it helps position us better when we do have the next attack that comes. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, can ATARC provide a link to the attack framework and defend framework? Yes, any documents that are listed, we'll take note of those and include them in a follow-up email. So if you're registered, you'll receive any resources that we can provide. Okay, next question. I'm curious about how the panel thinks of why IT staffing isn't one of those pillars. As agencies move towards zero trust, where and how can agencies staff up or better build up existing staff to help implement? Staffing with knowledge of zero trust seems essential in achieving it, and this person would like to see it addressed more. So what do our panelists think of that?
Kevin, you want to start? Kind of a softball right to what you're talking about before.
Well, right, and it is, and it kind of relates to the governance, component that you guys were smart to put in your security, in your maturity model as well. I mean, it's an absolutely valid point. It's very important, and ultimately we can't effectively implement these pillars if we don't have the right people rolled and responsible, right roles and responsibility in order to to do what we need to do. It's with countless organizations that we've seen organizations buy analytic capability, but they and almost in some cases they install it, but they don't train folks and establish a security team in order to look at it. So it's a good point, one that we'll take back, with any additional guidance that we put out. It follows along with still valid people, technology, processes. If I'm getting those three right, that we've believed in for a long time. Over.
I think one thing we've seen from our side was interesting when SolarWinds came out was, there's an automatic reaction, if you will, to, okay, zero trust can help mitigate these type of attacks. But what was interesting was the awareness of zero trust in magazines or articles like from the Wall Street Journal, from Fortune. And it really, what I was surprised at was the way zero trust resonated with the C-suite outside just our, security bubble. And so I think, as Kevin was mentioned before, we need to take this opportunity to educate the larger community that's going to be impacted by zero trust. Of course, we can here evangelize about zero trust, but understanding from the acquisition team what it's going to be different, to Kevin's point, the human resources team, all the different parts of the organization that will be impacted as the organization as a whole moves to zero trust. I think it's something that, yes, we do need to have a stronger education and awareness of across those agencies and organizations. Agreed.
Thank you. So let's go ahead and post our third and final poll question before we run out of time. In your opinion, how important is zero trust security to building cyber resilience? There we go. It's up on the screen now. So go ahead and answer that question back at home, that poll question back at home. And let's talk now about best practices. So since the issuance of the EO, have new trends, best practices, and zero trust implementation plans emerged that other agencies can follow or learn from? So anything that you guys have on best practices, starting with, who would like to begin?
So I think there's a lot of areas out there right now. Of course, we've already mentioned that ATARC has their lab they're starting. On the federal side, of course, NIST has their NCCOE that they're doing some activities with zero trust. Through the federal CIO Council, there's been a zero trust, I forget it's action committee or steering group, again, led through the CIO Council and Sylvia Burns. It's been active for a while. So there are a number of ways that I think zero trust is being distilled out, but we still need more in terms of workshops. Of course, the guidance that comes out with it. I think one of the challenges with the pandemic has just been we haven't been able to have those collaborative workshops like we had before. I think we're still trying to figure out how best to get more the worker bees, the architects, the engineers, the operators together to have them distill those lessons learned. But I agreed that there's some efforts, but there could always be more. Thank you.
Anyone else have any insight on what agencies should be focused on? Chandria?
Yeah, one thing Kevin mentioned, he mentioned roadmap, which I love. Every organization needs to start with some sort of roadmap. If you've got a policy in place, great, let's look at it, make sure it addresses the right things. If not, figure out how to put a policy in place. Let's figure out how we can move from sort of zero maturity to at least a 2 or 3, and continue to monitor that for progress to make sure that you're actually moving the needle to where you want it to be with that leadership buy-in, right? Keep those conversations with your leadership team to get the funding that you need to support this, and continue to move it forward. I mean, the only way to do this is in chunks. So we've got to start now and just take it piece by piece and move it forward.
Excellent insights. Thank you. Yep. And the zero trust demonstrations will be held pretty much every Friday until we get through all of our vendors. So you can, from your with government or with industry, you can block out that time on your calendar each week. So more information on that to come. All right, so let's see here. Will TIC be transforming from a north-south boundary solution to analyzing east-west traffic within federal networks? What are some thoughts around that? Sean, you're off mute. Would you like to try first?
Sure, yeah, I think someone's been watching my slide deck. So TIC 1, TIC 2 has really been about that north-south traffic corridor. While I recognize, the old solution, the old perimeter, or the old architecture, a lot of the traffic, of course, majority is more the east-west, which is more the on-prem user, the data centers, the different sensors, and really the majority of the traffic goes at the east-west, and that's not where the TIC program was focused. It was more interested in the traffic that was going to the big bad web, and the old models, the cloud architectures or the public users. So yeah, there is that shift, if you will, to be able to have a better understanding of the traffic that's more internal, or what that internally means today's architecture. So I won't limit it to say the TIC program is going to focus on it, but I think you can see from CISA, the larger, taking the aperture a little wider. Again, we mentioned the EDR program that's evolving out through CDM. So there is definitely a desire to have better awareness, not only the physical networks, of course, but closer to the assets themselves, whether it's an on-prem, whether it's in the cloud, whether it's remote users. Yes, I think there is a larger recognition to have a visibility of those environments. Kevin talked a little bit before about how the adversaries moving laterally across these environments, how they're living off the land. So we need to be able to understand what the adversary is doing, what tools the adversary is taking advantage of inside these networks. We can only do that by gaining a better grasp through the context of the east-west traffic. So yes.
Great, thank you. So we're pushing up against time, and I just want to make sure that each of our panelists have enough time to leave our audience with any lasting comments, advice, any takeaways that you got from this conversation. I know that for me anyways, it was really informative and insightful. So just pretend for a second that this is your last panel you're ever going to do, which is not the case, but let's just pretend. What do you want to leave our audience with? And let's start off with Kevin, please.
Yeah, so I, one of the things that I like to say in the end is that new models, new paradigms take time. It took us a while to go from bloodletting to germ theory. There were a lot of people that resisted that change back in those days. Obviously, same thing could be happens in ships, from old open hull wooden designs to steel and iron hulls with watertight compartments. So manage your expectations of how quickly we're going to get ultimately we want to get to. But As our director and the commander of Cybercom says, with Zero Trust, we're trying to prevent toeholds from becoming beachheads. Ultimately, we're trying to allow the military and NSS organizations to achieve their mission outcomes through a hostile environment, right? It's a war-fighting environment. We're in control of how we engineer the environments. We can take back that advantage. We just have to have a proper framework to do it. And those days of vulnerability of one shared by all, that one compromise leading to massive losses, has to go away. And we've got a way of getting there now. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Kevin. And then over to Elisa.
Yeah, I think Kevin, I just want to +1 what he said about, the moving forward and having a paradigm shift and cultural being significant, and, just trying our best with what we've got and taking this seriously, and that we're here to help, and that it's going to take a whole of government approach to this, and that what we're really trying to do is protect the mission, and that we have some really important missions within the government that are worth protecting.
Excellent. Thank you, Elisa. And I'm going to bump it over to Chandria.
Thank you. I would just say start the conversation. Anytime in government when we have a new challenge, it all starts with us sort of putting our heads together to do best practices, get lessons learned, and continue to talk about how we can do this better together. As Kevin and Alyssa said, give yourself some grace, right? We can't build Rome in one day, but start. We've got to start somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Chandria. And Jeff, what would you like to leave us with?
Well, I think that what we see in a lot of organizations, there's always competing priorities. And I like that Zero Trust is becoming a unified priority for a lot of organizations, which helps, right? But it takes really strong leadership. The one thing we see everywhere is that most teams just love a lot of the tools they have. They're very comfortable with them. And these legacy systems were just never designed to deal with the type of adversary we have. To Kevin's point earlier, it is a warfighting domain, and our adversaries have been leveraging that and a lot of the comfort that we have with these legacy systems. So, we find that strong leadership where it's a little bit of, we're going to burn the boats. There's no more money to maintain these systems. We have to move. But, that crawl, walk, and run approach, to Chandria's point earlier, I think it builds confidence because we have all been trying to do these types of things, right? They talk about moving to the cloud and security. And if you can hit some singles and doubles, it starts to, wear away at a little bit of the skepticism and frustration that people have, and you get a little bit of a flywheel effect. So, that's what that's where we would encourage people, and I think having the Zero Trust sort of rallying point is really, really helpful as we're seeing it roll out across government.
Thank you, Jeff. And we will end on Sean.
Sure, yeah. So government's obviously trying to move faster. Something I couldn't talk about today or yesterday, but I can talk about today is I'm one of the board members of the Tech Modernization Fund, and we just announced this morning the first of the next tranche of awards are coming out, and 3 of those awards are towards Zero Trust. So you have funding going towards GSA, you have funding going towards OPM, and funding towards education. Each of those we look at to be exemplar agency in starting to help not only move their own internal system towards Zero Trust, but use those lessons learned, as Jeffrey is talking about, and hitting those singles and doubles to help other agencies and help them move forward also. So I'm excited that was announced this morning, and I'm hoping that'll help the enterprise writ large move forward. Thank you.
You just need more money, Sean.
Yeah.
More money.
Yeah. And speaking of that, it's hard for me to talk today because thank you, Sean, for that money, because I am going to be using that for my product. Much appreciated.
Excellent. Well, thank you all again, our amazing panelists and our partners at Rubrik. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again next week for our Thursday webinar series. So I hope everybody has a great rest of their day and a fantastic weekend. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Good talk.